Hi everybody. I find it absolutely thrilling to be able to stop the action and capture an image of the cool and diverse, wonderful life in the underwater world. As you know, underwater photography can present many challenges. We've got to travel, use extensive equipment, overcome the water column, find, approach a suitable subject, take a picture with adequate lighting and focus, all while at the same time monitoring your depth, gauges, dive equipment, navigation, dive buddy. So many things can go wrong, and believe me, I've made almost every possible mistake you can imagine. Now, while I enjoy taking high-resolution shots of aquatic animals with my big SLR, expensive camera setup, I'll tell you, I more and more really enjoy shooting with a simple, compact camera in a housing, no strobe or flash, just using available light. Doing this, in my opinion, is a great way to get started in underwater photography if you've never done it before. But it can also be a really fun thing to do, even if you have the most expensive camera set up and you're very experienced. Now, some reasons why I love underwater photography with a compact camera and no strobe. First of all, it's relatively simple. It's easy to pack and transport and carry, easy to maneuver, much less expensive than a big bulky SLR camera, and more versatile. We can shoot wide angle, close focus wide angle, close up, all on one dive with one camera setup. And without a strobe or flash, we don't have to worry about those issues. Our strobe not firing, our flash not going off, too much or too little strobe power, backscatter, the dreaded backscatter, harsh shadows, access to our strobes, and balancing the lighting from our strobe in the foreground versus the natural light in the background. We don't have to worry about any of that. Now, there's a few disadvantages. Without a strobe or flash, our photos can be a little lackluster. They can lack some contrast, clarity, and color. We have to understand the water column and the exposure triangle, all right? Underwater, we are often in low light, and it's best to stay relatively shallow if we can. And as always, it's best to get close to our subject to reduce the water column, all right? And as always, it's good to be very familiar with your camera setup before the dive. Let's check out some examples. Light does not travel nearly as well through water as it does through air. The water column degrades color, contrast, and clarity. The water column is not only our depth, but also the distance of our camera to the subject. So it's the depth plus the distance of our camera to the subject. Now here I was fairly shallow on this shore dive in the Caymans, but this shark was way too distant. I wasn't close enough, so the water column reduced color, contrast, and some clarity. The whole image is kind of washed out. Now in this image, I was pretty close to this beautiful parrotfish, but I was too deep and still had too much water column, so I lost color, contrast, and clarity. However, if we can stay relatively shallow and get close to our subject, as in this image of a flying gurnard with my wife in the background, I've now reduced the water column and I have much better color, contrast, and clarity. I love that image. However, sometimes, even if we're fairly shallow and close to our subject, okay, with minimal water column, in the underwater world, there is often less light. We are in a low light environment. We could be diving at dusk or dawn, or in limited visibility, or under a bridge, or under a dock or wreck. Low light underwater photography presents problems with an image being too dark or too blurred or poor color. So here, even on a fairly bright day and a shallow dive, I saw this seahorse, but it was in the shadow behind a rock. The sun was in front of me instead of behind me, and the image is way too dark. Now here I tried to focus on the subject, and I got a blurred image from motion blur. I had adequate exposure, but my shutter speed was too slow. The eel was moving, a very blurred image. Another issue is white balance. In this image, everything has a blue or green tint. Okay, the focus and exposure is okay, but everything is blue. However, we can set our camera or adjust our white balance afterward such that it looks much better. And I'm going to show you how to do that as well. In this video series, we're going to talk about the exposure triangle and how we can juggle aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to get proper exposure, yet still have an image of high quality. It's best not to set our camera to auto and let the camera make all the decisions on our settings. And it's good if you can get a compact camera that allows you to control shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and take pictures in various modes like aperture priority mode. Okay, we'll have videos on how to read a histogram. We'll talk about how to focus, how to lock your focus on the subject and avoid motion blur. We'll talk about white balance issues, how to take pictures and try to avoid that blue or green tint. We'll talk about shooting in aperture priority mode so that our camera makes sure we have adequate exposure, but we can check our LCD and manipulate other settings such that we get a high image quality with the least manipulation of all of our camera's multiple controls. Now, some of this information is basic, but whether you're a beginner or experienced underwater photographer who'd like to take a break from transporting and dealing with expensive and bulky equipment, hopefully this video series might be helpful to you. I'm just going to talk basic principles, not get too bogged down in technical details, and I'm going to try to show lots of examples too, some failures and some successes of how to create cool underwater images with a compact camera and no flash. So I hope you enjoy this series. Thanks for tuning in.